Good afternoon. I'm Scott Sagan, co-director of the Center for International Security and Cooperation and professor of political science here at Stanford. And I want to welcome all of you to the first CSAC research seminar of the year. And let me say two things before I introduce the speakers. One, it's a real pleasure to be here in person and see many of you. I know we have many people joining on Zoom as well. But it's great not to have to say, Steve, you're muted. Please unmute yourself after so long, and to have the pleasure of each other's company and intellectual community. Second, I want to say that this is the first of a series that we'll be conducting jointly with the Center for Ethics in Society on ethics and political violence, and I'll be going over some of the forthcoming seminars in that series. But this is really appropriate to start our year, seminar on 9/11 in Afghanistan 20 years later. And I'll very briefly, because we have so little time, give an abbreviated introduction to each of the speakers. In reverse alphabetical order, today we're going to have Amy Ziegert, the Morris Arnold and Nolan Jean Cox Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Senior Fellow at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute. Amy, as you know, and as you can see for those of you in the room, is the author of Bites, Bombs, and Spies, co-authored with Herb Lin, and has a forthcoming book, Spies, Lies, and Algorithms. I get a pattern here. I'm a social scientist. I can pick this up, coming out with Princeton in February 2022. Our second speaker will be Asfandyar Mir, a senior expert at the Asia Center at the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, and a senior lecturer here teaching the International Relations Introduction course in the Department of Political Science. For a number of years, he was holding various fellowships here. The Center for International Security and Cooperation has many pieces in the monkey cage, recently in the Sentinel, publication of the Center for Terrorism Studies, the Counterterrorism Studies from West Point, and most recently in the New York Times. And last speaker will be Joe Felter, the William J. Perry Fellow here at CSAC and a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. Joe served as the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Oceania from 2017 to 2019, and is the co-author of Small Wars, Big Data, the Information Revolution, and Modern Conflict. So I'm going to turn it over to Amy. We'll have brief comments from each, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. As is the tradition here, we're going to ask the fellows. We'll give the right to make the first couple questions, and then we'll open it up for a general audience, okay? Amy, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Scott. Let me just echo what a delight it is to actually be in person at CSAC again, and especially to be on this panel with my friends and colleagues, Asfandyar, Joe, and Scott. What I want to focus in my remarks is on U.S. intelligence. And in particular, I want to look backward and I want to look forward. Backward at what we should have learned, and I hope we have learned about the intelligence failures that led to 9/11, and forward at the intelligence challenges we face today and are likely to face tomorrow. Now, I'm going to commit an unnatural act for an academic, which is to summarize 20 years of research in 2 words. Organization matters. Whenever failure strikes, there is a natural tendency to blame individual leaders. We see that now with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, putting the blame on President Biden or Secretary of State Blinken. After 9/11, we saw this as well with criticism of President Bush, President Clinton, CIA Director George Tenet. But more often, what I found, the root causes of failure lie not in individual mistakes, but in organizational deficiencies, in organizational structures, incentives, and cultures. These organizational features are what lead good individuals to make poor decisions. I often like to say organizations are like the dark matter of the policy universe. Everyone knows they're there, they're invisible, and they powerfully influence everything in ways that are often hard to understand. We know now, 20 years later, that 9/11 was a surprise attack that should not have been a surprise. Evidence clearly shows that US intelligence agencies saw the terrorist danger in the 1990s, and yet they still failed to stop it. Now, the real question is why? Why did they fail to stop it if they saw it? And the answer I found is that these organizations failed to adapt to the end of the Cold War. They were hardwired with organizational structures and cultures and incentives designed to fight a Soviet enemy from a bygone era. Let me give you just a couple of examples. I found that intelligence budgets in the 1990s continued pouring money into technological platforms that were ideally suited for counting Soviet warheads from space, while they underfunded human intelligence, better suited for penetrating terrorist groups on the ground. The FBI declared terrorism its #1 priority in 1998, 3 years before 9/11. And yet, on 9/11, only 6% of the FBI's personnel, 6%, were working on counterterrorism issues. In 2001, special agents at the FBI received more time for vacation than counterterrorism training. These organizational weaknesses led the Bureau and the CIA, I found, to miss 23 different opportunities that could have penetrated the 9/11 plot and possibly have stopped the attack. We'll never know whether penetrating the plot would have stopped the attack, but the evidence is certainly tantalizing. Let me give you a snapshot of just 2 of those 23 missed opportunities. In January of 2000, nearly 2 years before 9/11, CIA officials were surveilling an Al-Qaeda planning meeting in Malaysia, and they identified 2 suspected high-level Al-Qaeda operatives. Okay? And yet, these 2 operatives, I should add, went on to crash American Airlines 77 into the Pentagon on 9/11. This information about these 2 operatives was ultimately made available to more than 50 CIA officials. None of them thought to share this information with the FBI or the State Department for over a year. Why didn't they share this information? The most basic explanation is they've never needed to share that kind of information before. For the entire Cold War, the CIA never put any priority. There was no training, no priority, no process for identifying dangerous terrorists who might be traveling to the United States and warning other government agencies about them. Example number 2. 19 days before 9/11, the CIA does tell the FBI about these 2 men, Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi. What does the FBI do? It launches a nationwide manhunt that is actually only led by 1 of its 56 field offices in New York. It labels the manhunt routine, the lowest level of priority, and it hands the manhunt to a special agent who had just finished his rookie year in the FBI and had never led this kind of investigation before. This too was not a mistake. It was not an individual screw up. This was the natural result of organizational deficiencies. Before 9/11, every intelligence investigation, which was designed to prevent something that might or might not happen in the future, was given lower priority than every law enforcement investigation designed to find perpetrators of past criminal behavior. And why was the manhunt given to the least experienced agent on the squad? Because he was the least experienced agent on the squad. It was the least desirable job in a law enforcement agency. And so it went to the least experienced person. Now, we know now that these 2 terrorists were hiding in plain sight before 9/11. They lived in San Diego using their true names on everything from their credit cards to their rental agreements. One of them was listed in the San Diego telephone directory. They both lived with an FBI informant for a while, all unknown to the FBI. These 2 hijackers did not need secret identities, and they didn't need clever schemes to succeed. They only needed to count on the CIA and the FBI operating as they always had in the Cold War. Organizations matter. Let me turn now to the current day and what intelligence challenges we face now. Since 9/11, and I'm sure Esfandiar and Joe will talk about this, our intelligence agencies have been retooled and they've been reformed to focus on the counterterrorism mission. And that focus and reform has produced some successes. It is notable that we have not had a mass casualty Al-Qaeda attack on the homeland in 20 years. If you had said on September the 12th that that would have been the future, nobody would have believed you. And it is notable that our intelligence agencies did ultimately find Osama bin Laden and help bring him to justice. But the threat landscape never sleeps. The intelligence community, I would argue, has mastered the Al-Qaeda problem, but Al-Qaeda is no longer the central problem that it once was. Today's threat landscape has never been more complex, and the key dangers are arising from emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, commercialization of satellites, internet connectivity, and more. In cyberspace, for example, enemies can attack us now across vast distances without firing a shot, hacking our minds as well as our machines. Until now, there are two things that protected the United States: power and geography. Those two things do not protect the United States in cyberspace anymore. In fact, we're more vulnerable in cyberspace than most countries because we're the most digitally connected and because our freedom of speech makes possible deception at scale using these emerging technological tools. This cyber era brings another moment of reckoning for intelligence, akin to the moment of reckoning on 9/11. It is an adapt or fail moment again. And once again, our intelligence agencies are hardwired to fight the last war. And that war is the global war on terror. The integration of intelligence and warfighting is one of the most consequential organizational changes since 9/11. Today, intelligence and military activities are often hard to distinguish. The intelligence community, for example, sometimes conducts drone strikes on their own. The military sometimes conducts drone strikes on their own, and sometimes they conduct them together. It is hard to tell apart the activities of the Pentagon from the CIA at times. Now, this tight integration has some benefits, and I'm sure we'll hear more about them, but it carries significant risks that I think we haven't fully dealt with yet. The CIA's primary mission has never been supporting warfighters on battlefields. The CIA's primary mission is to prevent strategic surprise to the nation. And by that, I mean understanding threats before they materialize and giving senior policymakers decision advantage to prevent bad outcomes in the first place. The agency was created after Pearl Harbor to prevent another Pearl Harbor. Defense and intelligence may seem like they're the same, but they are not. The Pentagon's primary activity is fighting. The CIA's primary activity is understanding. The military is supposed to win wars. The CIA is supposed to prevent them by gathering intelligence to understand threats and opportunities better than our adversaries. Troops are trained to be hunters. Intelligence officials are trained to be gatherers. Samuel Huntington famously wrote that military officers are trained in the management of violence. Intelligence officers are trained in the management of information. 20 years of fighting terrorists has eroded the CIA's core capability of collecting and analyzing intelligence to prevent strategic surprise. And it has stretched the agency thin. Don't take my word for it. Take the words of CIA directors from the past 3 presidential administrations: Mike Hayden in the Bush administration, John Brennan in the Obama administration, Gina Haspel in the Trump administration. All 3 of these CIA directors have voiced concerns that fighting terrorism has pulled the agency too far into tactical day-to-day warfighting intelligence, and that the CIA needs to get back to basics, collecting and analyzing threats, intelligence about emerging threats before it's too late. No organization can do it all. The CIA, I think, needs to regain the balance between fighting the terrorist adversaries of today and understanding, detecting, and preventing an array of threats over the horizon. And I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Scott, for the introduction. Thank you, CSAC, for convening today's discussion, the sponsors, the co-sponsors of the event, and thank you to all of you for joining. I'm delighted to be a part of this conversation with mentors that I have learned from on this particular issue, among many others, over the last few years. And obviously, given the pandemic, we've not been able to get together, so it's really, really great to be back in this room. September 11th, 2001 was the day the world changed. The 2,977 deaths in those dastardly terrorist attacks The shocking nature of those attacks led to massive policy changes and dominated US politics and discourse for years to come. Uh, Obviously, the United States went to war in Afghanistan to topple the Taliban as a direct consequence of those attacks. The attacks also, unfortunately, I'd argue, contributed to the US decision to invade Iraq. And the group that triggered all of this change was Al-Qaeda. 9/11 was certainly an intelligence failure, as you know, as Dr. Ziegert just argued. The organizational politics of it was of that failure was pretty deep. But it was also, in many ways, a policy failure in imagining the potential power of a group like Al-Qaeda against the United States. As I've sifted through testimonies of that period in the lead up to 9/11, it is clear that US policymakers, other than some select leaders, didn't think much of Al-Qaeda. Conventional wisdom at the time was that this was a group of angry, ragtag Arab men. Sure, one of them, known initially as Abu Abdullah and later as Osama bin Laden, had a lot of money. But what could he really do? The twin bombings of the U.S. embassies in Kenya and in Tanzania in 1998, the foiled plot to bomb LAX on the eve of the millennium, and even the bombing of the destroyer, naval destroyer USS Cole by the Yemeni coastline, couldn't compel U.S. policymakers to imagine the ambition of Al-Qaeda. And this country paid dearly on the eve of 9/11, as well as for 2 decades after that, for that lack of imagination. So the question is, what made Al-Qaeda tick? How was it able to mount such a major challenge? And I'd argue sustain that challenge for the last 2 decades. First and foremost, Al-Qaeda was and remains deeply resolved in confronting the United States. This is an attribute of sorts. Political resolve, not many combatants have that, or at least have it, are able to retain it over a period of time. Al-Qaeda leader bin Laden first became interested in confronting the US in the mid-90s, only to topple US allied rulers in places like Saudi Arabia. But later on, his goals evolved, expanded, and confrontation with the United States really took center stage. And that hasn't changed to this day. After all that has happened, despite immense incentives to moderate or shift direction, more than 500 drone strikes targeting and killing many members of that organization, Al-Qaeda remains determined to confront the United States. So its political resolve is really is an important factor which has allowed it to mount a major challenge. Second key factor, Al-Qaeda was able to further this idea that the West and the Muslim world were at war with each other. And in turn, use this idea to alter the politics of various parts of the Middle East, South Asia, as well as Africa. I mean, over the last 20 years, Al-Qaeda has successfully lit the fire of jihadism in general, and Salafi jihadism in particular, and turned it into a formidable political force. I mean, consider the relative change. On the eve of 9/11, Al-Qaeda and its various jihadi allies had limited organizational presence in much of the Middle East and Africa. There was some in South Asia, but in the years after, jihadists have expanded in Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, Pakistan, and Yemen, and have become major political players in each of these countries. The Afghan Taliban, the regime that was toppled by the United States government, mounted a return on a strong jihadist platform, which was also influenced by Al-Qaeda. And then Al-Qaeda's post-9/11 impact in places like Somalia and the Sahel is also undeniable. The aggregate effect of the emergence and the persistence of jihadism in all of these places is that it has enormously burdened the United States and its allies. This in turn has triggered a major domestic political as well as policy conversation on reducing US military footprint in various parts of the world, including the Middle East. Final factor which has enabled Al-Qaeda, ability to forge and maintain important alliances. Pre 9/11, it forged an alliance with the Afghan Taliban. Post 9/11, again, despite immense pressure, international condemnation, that alliance did not break. Al-Qaeda and the Afghan Taliban remain partners to this day. Al-Qaeda also established an important relationship with the Pakistani Taliban, which allowed Al-Qaeda to project the most serious second wave of threats directed towards the US homeland territory post 9/11. And now the group has an important, even if constrained, alliance with the Iranian government, which has helped a substantial chunk of Al-Qaeda senior leadership to evade US and international targeting pressures. So that's on the side of successes for Al-Qaeda. The question is, where has the group failed and the US government has succeeded? I'd argue in two ways. First, Al-Qaeda also failed to imagine and respond to the ferocity and precision of the US counterterrorism response. Dr. Ziegert spoke about the merging of the US intelligence machine and the military machine. And Al-Qaeda just didn't see it coming. It had no real response to the suite of these rapid response capabilities in general, and the armed drone in particular. By the time the US had invaded Iraq, bin Laden was pretty intent on bleeding the US into exhaustion by incubating, supporting anti-US insurgencies in the Middle East and South Asia. And then initially, it appeared his plan was working. US first got into the quicksand of the Iraqi insurgency, and after that, Afghanistan and nuclear-armed Pakistan became major challenges and headaches for US policymakers. But then US counterterrorism strikes started picking out Al-Qaeda's top and mid-ranking leadership. They degraded Al-Qaeda's important transnational and regional capabilities, not all, but some really important ones, in very challenging circumstances. And these capabilities also deterred political alignments in favor of Al-Qaeda and its ecosystem. Second big failure of Al-Qaeda, which is not exactly a success for the United States, I'd argue. As Al-Qaeda expanded, it struggled to control some of its partners and affiliates. Initially, it failed to rein in their violence against civilians, which alienated large swaths of the Muslim world. And Al-Qaeda really struggled to become a popular political entity in most parts of the Muslim world. Later on, it experienced serious internal organizational political trouble. It ended up losing two of its biggest affiliates. ISIS came out of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and Jabhat al-Nusra, the anti-Assad jihadist faction in Syria, also separated itself from Al-Qaeda. Okay. So that's on the side of successes and failures. I want to conclude with a warning, especially in light of the events in Afghanistan. The return of the Taliban is the worst possible outcome from a counterterrorism perspective, because as I mentioned, Al-Qaeda's alliance with the Taliban endures. It is also iconic for purposes of propaganda, recruitment, sort of furthering Al-Qaeda's political profile. Al-Qaeda is already making the argument that its partner, the Taliban, has defeated the United States, so more jihadi victories around the world are viable. The Biden administration keeps using the language of Al-Qaeda reconstituting in say, Afghanistan in a certain period of time. This implies Al-Qaeda will be starting over. That's just not true. Over the last 5 to 7 years, Al-Qaeda has built meaningful capability in the country by adapting itself to some of the pressures of the US counterterrorism machine. And Al-Qaeda's top leadership still remains in Afghanistan. Most indicators suggest that Al-Qaeda chief Ayman al-Zawahiri has remained in Afghanistan for some years now. There are other major jihadis with more regional aims in the country as well. And then there is intra-jihadi competition. ISIS is not impressed with this ostensible victory of Al-Qaeda and its allies, and would like to compete with outbidding violence. All of this is to say that Al-Qaeda and its allies are strongly positioned to leverage this permissive environment that they have in Afghanistan. We might be willing to call an end to this particular war, but I'd argue the adversary is not ready yet. It is preparing for another round of hostilities, and while all of these other new threats have also emerged. Thank you.
It's always hard to bat cleanup, but it's great to be here. Scott, thanks for the invitation. It's great to see Amy Nasfandiar. I literally started out my time at Stanford here, and so great memories of CSAC, and it's wonderful to be back here, even on this tough topic. But so I'm a former military guy, kind of a rule follower, and the prompt said we're going to talk about successes, failures, surprises, and lessons. So I'm actually going to hit those. That's not too rote. But let me just start off with a disclaimer. You know, a lot of you, some of you are veterans that are dialed in here. You know, we've lost friends, mentors, your own soldiers. You know, I taught cadets at West Point where I'm grading their papers one year and I'm going to their graveside services the next year. So the feelings about Afghanistan, they're not political, but really personal for a lot of us, certainly military and our veterans. So I think there's a certain cognitive dissonance that, you know, we want to believe that so much sacrifice was for something. And so it's really hard just to let go of that and be too objective here. And on that note, let me just take a half minute to remind us of the human toll of these last 20 years. In 2,448 U.S. military killed in action, 20,752 wounded, some of them horribly maimed and crippled, 3,846 contractors killed, suicides, PTSD. I mean, the impact across America is still being felt. You know, our coalition casualties, almost 1,200. Some countries experience higher casualties per capita than the United States, and that's important to know. The Afghan security forces, almost 70,000 dead. Afghan civilians, many different estimates, but you know, close to 50,000, if not much more. And these are real people. They're not just data points in a spreadsheet that we're studying. So again, I would argue to start out that we fought two wars in Afghanistan. I like to characterize that we fought a war of necessity, the aftermath of 9/11, which Amy described so well, you know, safeguarding America's, you know, from transnational terrorist threats that Asfandiar described. The other was, I would argue, a war of choice, that we wanted to transform Afghanistan. We wanted to bring democracy, freedoms, access to education, and other improvements to the country. I mean, well intended, of course. So let me hit the successes, the failures, the surprises, and the lessons for both those wars in the remainder of my time. So the war of necessity, the counterterrorism fight, the success. Well, as Amy described, we haven't had a catastrophic terrorist event since 9/11, and that's just not by accident. The credit goes to some of the reforms that were discussed as far as across the interagency and the intelligence community, and a lot of tireless, hard work by our military, our law enforcement, and across the interagency every day. Every day we didn't have a catastrophic attack, I would argue, was a victory in some way. And a lot of credit goes to all the men and women who made that possible. I would say, you know, in my own world, in the military, you know, Joint Special Operations Command, we were able to, you know, find, fix, finish. I mean, you remember General McChrystal and JSOC. He famously went transformed that organization into a world-class organization, able to, you know, identify terrorists and get them off the battlefield quickly. And successes of the war of choice. Let's be honest. I mean, a generation of Afghans were provided a much better quality of life. And you look at so many indicators: literacy, infant mortality, other indicators. Certainly, the quality of life of women, most especially. So let's hope this generation that experienced these freedoms, you know, won't give it up too readily, and maybe that'll help complicate the Taliban's efforts to take it away, which they will certainly try to do and are doing now. So some of the failures in both those wars. You know, well, first of all, we lost. You know, there's the failure. We lost the war, and that image of a desperate Afghan teenager literally falling off the fuselage of a C-17. So that hurts. That hurts as an American and certainly as a veteran to see. This is not a political comment, but I would say the way we departed, you know, who we left behind and at risk, I think that's a moral injury that's going to take many years to heal, if ever, for America. Failures of the war of choice. I was there in 2010, 2011, the height of the surge, working for General McChrystal and General Petraeus. And Amy, you described it, good people doing bad things. This is a great case. I mean, these are our greatest leaders. You know, we thought we could win. We thought we could actually stabilize Afghanistan and bring these democracy and reforms that we hope so much for the people. We thought we could. It was well intended, but it certainly was overreach. Looking back, I think it was a failure to appreciate what was really in the realm of the possible. But I would argue we've stopped fighting this war years ago. And President Obama declared the end of combat operations in 2014, and we went from 100,000 soldiers there at the height of the surge, 2011, where we lost 500, you know, Americans killed in action, to, you know, 2,500, you know, this year. And we hadn't had experience of casualty in 16 months until the tragic 13 American service members killed at the airport. So other failures, the failures of the war of necessity. Well, you know, President Trump and President Biden chose to go to zero. You know, but I would argue America can't unilaterally declare this war is over. And Asfandiar just made a great case that this war it's still on, right? The enemy gets a vote. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and others, they're going to continue to plot to harm us. So now we're obliged to fight this war from a much more disadvantageous position. You think about our loss of intelligence networks, you know, persistent ISR, and so many of the capabilities that we need to be able to rapidly and effectively interdict terrorist threats. I would argue that over the horizon counterterrorism is kind of an oxymoron, and maybe we can bring it up in Q&A. So moving on, surprises. Well, I think we're all surprised at the speed of the collapse, certainly. I think when, in hindsight, maybe we shouldn't have been as surprised that when the Afghans realized Americans were leaving, they were going to cut new deals and leave. But I think it surprised all of us, the speed of the collapse. But some lessons from the war of choice. I would say, lesser set realistic objectives, avoid mission creep, just the standard. My experience in counterinsurgency, that counterinsurgency can only be as good as the government it supports. If you're trying to support a corrupt government that's not legitimate in the eyes of the people, you're just never going to move the ball. You're never going to get there. I would argue it was never really in the military's hands to win or lose. It was bringing legitimate governance to the country. And no matter how hard we fought, how effectively the military fought, both coalition and Afghanistan, if the Afghans didn't view the government as legitimate, we were going to lose that fight. So lessons of the war. Oh, I'm going to actually lessons of the war of choice, and this kind of goes to maybe the academic crowd. Independent of the debacle that became Afghanistan, we did learn some lessons because now we had a whole lot of data to study counterinsurgency. So maybe there are some lessons from counterinsurgency, like protecting the population and discrimination, which I've had a privilege of working with Scott Sagan on. The importance of information as far as in dispersing aid. There's a lot of things we learned from this fight that hopefully can help us be more effective in the future. And let's see, lessons from the war of necessity, the counterterrorism fight. I would say there probably is one positive lesson, that small footprint counterterrorism can be effective. If you know General Scott Miller, he's a good friend of mine. I grew up in special forces with him. With 2,500 Americans and some enablers and some coalition support, he was able to I would say effectively address the terrorist threat with a very small footprint. And I think maybe we could do that if we have to again someday, when we might have to. So it remains to be seen, I think, the degree to which these terrorist organizations are going to reconstitute on Afghan territory. And Asfandiar, I think you gave us a great preview of that. But as Asfandiar said, this is a huge victory for the Taliban, and there couldn't be any worse outcome. The Taliban means Al-Qaeda in many respects, given their alliance. So I'm afraid we're going to relearn some of the tough lessons in the months and years ahead. This Taliban infighting, ISIS-K, the civil war, all these things are going to unfold that, the conditions are going to be ripe for terrorist safe havens again. So I would say thanks to some of the reforms and changes that happen in America, we're at risk here in America, but I would say less so. But I think the next terrorist attack is going to happen, and it's going to happen in India. It's going to happen in one of our allies and partners, and we're going to have to deal with that. And I argue that not only are we in a more disadvantageous position to continue this war of necessity, this counterterrorism fight. Think of great power competition. Think of countries like Russia and China and Iran, Pakistan. They're all in a much better position now that we've departed in the way we departed. So on that optimistic note, I've got a few other points to make, but I'm getting close on time, and I'll turn it back over to you, Scott, for questions.
For the sake of time, since we have many questions coming in through Zoom chat, we're going to summarize a theme, which is about whether you believe that blowback was the main cause of the U.S. failure in Afghanistan. One questioner asks, is it true that the reason for the easy Taliban takeover is that it was perceived as the lesser of two evils, in contrast to the U.S. drone war and the Ghani government's corruption in Afghanistan? Maybe you're the one to start with that.
Yeah, sure. Okay. So I think the cause of the failure of the war, well, there are many causes, multiple causes of the war, and one of them certainly is the alienation of the civilian population. The fact that the Afghan government did not enjoy a lot of legitimacy in various parts of the country, especially outside of the urban centers, it is very true. And this process started soon after the U.S. toppled the Taliban. The reliance on predatory warlords for the counterterrorism mission, ended up having these long-term legacies and pushed a big part of the population, towards the Taliban, and compelled alignments in favor of the Taliban. So all of that's true. But I think there were other major failures as well. The sanctuary problem, in Pakistan, made the mission exceedingly hard, without inflicting any real damage to the political echelon of the Taliban. It was impossible to make major headway or compel the Taliban to make any kind of meaningful concessions. I also think the US developmental approach was deeply flawed. I think it ended up fueling corruption in the country, and it further delegitimized the Afghan government. So, as a political scientist, all the variables that I can think of which can contribute to the success or failure of a counterinsurgency mission, I think they maxed on their respective values in the direction of a failure.
Just a quick comment. The Afghan, Ghana's government was bad. It was corrupt. It was where to start or where to stop as far as listing its failures and shortcomings. But I guarantee you, a year from now, if you ask the lesser of two evils, certainly ask any women in Afghanistan, whether living under a corrupt Ghana government was worse than living under the Taliban. I guarantee you the Taliban are going to show their true colors. This notion that there's a 2.0, they're going to be different, I just think is wishful thinking. They're going to be just as horrific as they were in the mid-90s. We're going to see that unfold. And I think anyone in Afghanistan is going to wish for the good old days of the corruption of Ashraf Ghani. I'm sorry, Scott.
Can any of you comment on a different kind of blowback, the blowback on American society? January 6th represented an insurrection of, not unprecedented, because after all, there was a civil war, there was an insurrection, but since that time, unprecedented. Ashley Babbitt, the woman who was killed in the insurrection, was a QAnon supporter who earlier was an Air Force security guard. And then after she entered civilian life, she became a nuclear power plant security guard. You've been all talking about potential threats in the future, but none of you mentioned the domestic terrorism threat, which I think is deeply serious, is underestimated, and has some relationship to the last 20 years, although I don't know exactly what that relationship is. Thoughts, comments?
Sounds like an Amy question.
Thanks, Joe. Punch it in my way.
Yeah, I mean, Scott, as always, you get us all to think harder and more deeply. I don't know all of the, it's hard for me to disaggregate the variables that have led to this moment, right? I agree that the January 6th insurrection was a very serious moment. I think far more serious than even the media has portrayed it to be, right? This was an attempted coup of our country, and it could have led to tremendous loss of life of our leadership, but for the grace of God, right? So, and it's hard when there's a near miss like that, right? As you've written about, Scott, we can interpret that in one of two ways. The system is working well, right? Or the system is about to fail. And we don't know which of those we're facing, but we know that polarization is a huge problem. And we know the FBI has said that right-wing domestic supremacist nationalist terrorism is a really serious problem in our country. How to combat that is a big challenge. Again, I'm going to go back to organizations matter, right? The National Counterterrorism Center, which has grown so adept at countering foreign-based terrorism, does not have the authorities, for reasons that are understandable, civil liberties and others, to play a role in purely or largely domestic terrorist threats. That's the role of the FBI. So there's a challenge now about where does freedom of speech end and incitement to violence begin in an internet era where it looks like that distance between speech and action is narrowing and it's blurring. And we don't have the organizational setup to actually collaborate to better understand and deal with what is a very complex problem.
Another question from the room. Yes, Steve.
This question is slightly related to the one that came before, and it's for Asfandir. It deals with
Can you introduce yourself briefly?
Oh, sorry. I'm Stephen Buono. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at CSAC. I have a question about culture and ideology. You said during your presentation that Al-Qaeda pitched its war as one of jihadism against the West. And I think we would all agree that to varying degrees, President Bush and his successors came to interpret it the same way, and that this had enormous implications for how we fought the war on terror. So I'd just like to get your comments about where do you think we are in terms of interpreting or framing the war as one of Western modernity versus medieval jihadism, and what implications do you think that's going to continue to have?
So I think in the first decade after 9/11, the brand or the civilizational conflict frame that Al-Qaeda sought to push, it was embraced by political elites in this country as well as other parts of the Western world, which certainly exacerbated the problem quite a bit. And parts of the Muslim world had had this very strong strand sentiment that this was West against the Muslim world. I think over the last decade, things have improved. These civilizational frames have been replaced by the idea that there are some jihadist actors are there in different parts of the Muslim world, but perhaps they're fringe, they're not part of the mainstream. Extremist violence does not represent the mainstream political opinion in different parts of the Muslim world. I think this is much better understood in various US bureaucracies at the political level. At least part of the political spectrum certainly understands that. So I think we've made some progress. But I worry, what will happen if there is another mass casualty attack? Scott spoke about, brought up the domestic blowback, which is, and I think that's one of the main reasons why I think it's very important to foil, any next major attack, because it can unleash some of these terrible pathologies here at home, fuel polarization, erode societal harmony, and it can also trigger more sort of international polarization, especially between the U.S. and the Muslim world. And I think the best way to avoid that is to prevent the next transnational terror attack from happening in any part of the United States.
Just food for thought there. We didn't even need a terrorist attack to institute a temporary travel ban on all.
Sure. Yeah.
There are many more questions in the room and online, but we've run out of time. And before we thank the speakers, I want to let you know the next seminars in this particular Ethics and Political Violence series will be on October 19th from 3 to 4 p.m., where Sherry Cribbs, Associate Professor of Law at the Dean of Law School and the co-lead in the Cybersecurity Cooperative Research Center, will be speaking online on Zoom on drone cinema, data practices, and the developing new scope of international humanitarian law jurisdiction. And then on December 9th from 3:30 to 5 in the Director Series, Deborah Perlstein, Professor of Law and the co-director of the Center for Constitutional Democracy at Yeshiva University in New York, will be presenting a paper called Lawyering the Presidency, Legal Counsel and the Constraint on the Use of Force. So I hope you will join us for those seminars, as well as the other seminars that are announced weekly on the CSAC email chain. So let me just say in the end, it is a great pleasure to meet in person finally after so long. This was not an uplifting seminar, but it was an illuminating seminar, and you've gotten us off to a great start. So thank you.
Thanks.